Before we begin our story, I want to invite you to subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to continue bringing you compelling narratives of drama, justice, and empowerment. Click that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Now, let's delve into today's story. The call came on a Tuesday, a day typically governed by the unwavering rhythm of early morning drills, strategic briefings, and the quiet hum of a base operating at peak efficiency. Morgan was in her office, a space as Spartan and orderly as her life, reviewing personnel deployment schedules for an upcoming joint forces exercise. The sterile, fluorescent light glinted off the polished surface of her desk, where every item had its designated place. It was a world of precision, a universe away from the chaotic emotional landscape she had escaped 2 decades prior. The encrypted phone on the corner of her desk, reserved for secure military communications, remained silent. It was her personal cell, a sleek, anonymous piece of technology that buzzed with an unknown number from a familiar area code. She almost ignored it. Unscheduled calls were inefficiencies, potential disruptions to a carefully calibrated day. But something, a flicker of an old instinct she thought she had disciplined into submission, made her answer. The voice on the other end was reedy and unfamiliar, a junior associate from a law firm in the coastal town she once called home. The words were clipped professional, yet they carried the weight of a dropped guillotine. Her father, David, was dead. A sudden, massive coronary event. The funeral was on Friday. The reading of the will would follow on Monday. Her presence, the voice noted with a distinct lack of warmth, was requested. Morgan listened without a single change in her expression. Her posture remained ramrod straight, her eyes fixed on the map of the world pinned to the wall opposite her. She registered the information as she would a battlefield report, objective facts, logistical details, and emotional variables to be suppressed. There was no surge of grief. The connection to the man who had sired her had been severed years ago, not by death, but by a deliberate, calculated excision on his part and a reluctant acceptance on hers. He had wanted a daughter who was an ornament, a beautiful, biddable creature to be married off to a man of his choosing, cementing a local dynasty built on his modest real estate empire. He envisioned a future for her filled with garden parties, charity galas, and quiet deference. He had not, under any circumstances, envisioned a daughter who would find her calling in the rigorous, unforgiving world of military service. Their final conversation had been a maelstrom of ultimatums and fury. He had called her ambition an aberration, a grotesque betrayal of her femininity and her family. He had stood in the grand foyer of their home, his face purple with rage, and declared that if she walked out that door to join the armed forces, she would cease to be his daughter. She would be an orphan of her own making, dead to him, erased from the family ledger. Morgan, then a fiercely determined 18-year-old with more courage than experience, had met his gaze, her own resolve hardening into steel. She had walked out that door and had never in 22 years looked back. Now he was gone. The man who had been a titan of anger in her memory was reduced to a date on a death certificate and a legal proceeding on a Monday morning. The associate on the phone cleared his throat, mistaking her silence for shock. "Ms. Morgan, are you there?" he asked, his voice betraying a hint of youthful impatience. "I'm here," she replied, her own voice a low, steady cadence that could command battalions. "Send me the details via email. I will be in attendance." She ended the call before he could offer any pro forma condolences she knew he didn't mean. For a long moment, she sat perfectly still, the silence of her office amplifying the turmoil she refused to acknowledge. Attending was not about mourning. It was about closure. It was a tactical necessity, the final reconnaissance of a battlefield she had long since abandoned. She needed to see the crater left by the explosion of her departure, to confirm the casualties, and to officially sign the treaty that would end a war only she seemed to remember was still being waged. She stood, her movements economical and precise, and walked to the window overlooking the vast, meticulously maintained training grounds. Her life was here now, in the disciplined lines of soldiers marching in unison, in the clear-eyed purpose of service, in the meritocracy that judged her not by her gender or her family name, but by her competence and her leadership. She had not just found a career. She had forged a new identity, one built from grit and sacrifice. She had risen through the ranks on her own terms, earning the respect of her peers and the loyalty of her subordinates. Here, she was not the disobedient daughter. She was a commander. Yet the summons back to that suffocating, gilded cage of a house was a pull from a past she had never fully managed to outrun. It was a final test of her defenses, a deployment into the one territory that still had the power to breach her walls, the ghost-filled hallways of her childhood home. The journey back was a surreal exercise in temporal displacement. The sleek, modern efficiency of the military transport that flew her to a regional airfield slowly gave way to a rented sedan, which in turn carried her through landscapes that seemed to be actively resisting the passage of time. The highways narrowed into winding coastal roads, flanked by windswept cypress trees and glimpses of a gray, moody ocean. The town itself, nestled in a cove, appeared almost unchanged, a living museum of her youth. The same quaint storefronts lined the main street, the same salty tang hung in the air, the same quiet judgment seemed to emanate from the shuttered windows of the stately old houses. Her family's home stood at the end of a long, manicured lane, a formidable colonial structure that had always seemed more like a monument to her father's aspirations than a place of warmth or comfort. As she pulled into the gravel driveway, she saw her sister's luxury SUV parked near the entrance. Of course. Sophie would be here, playing the part of the grieving, dutiful daughter. Morgan cut the engine and sat for a moment, steeling herself. She could face down hostile negotiations with foreign dignitaries and inspect troops in active combat zones without a flicker of apprehension, but the prospect of walking through that front door made a cold knot tighten in her stomach. The door opened before she could reach it. Her mother, Alina, stood framed in the doorway, a spectral figure in muted gray. She had aged, but not in a way that suggested wisdom or grace. The years had simply faded her, washing out her features and stooping her shoulders, as if the sheer force of her husband's personality had been the only thing holding her upright. Her eyes, pale and watery, widened slightly at the sight of Morgan in her simple, dark civilian clothes. There was no embrace, no warm greeting, just a hesitant, fluttering gesture of her hand. "Morgan, you came," she whispered, her voice as fragile as a dried leaf. "Hello, Mother," Morgan said, her tone level and devoid of accusation. She stepped over the threshold and the scent of the house enveloped her, a cloying mix of lemon polish, wilting flowers, and something else, something stagnant and airless, like a room sealed for decades. The interior was exactly as she remembered it, immaculate, ostentatious, and utterly lifeless. The grand foyer with its ridiculously oversized chandelier, the formal living room with its furniture shrouded in protective plastic under dust covers, the gallery of family portraits where her own face had been conspicuously absent for years. It was a mausoleum of a life she had refused to live. Sophie emerged from the living room, a vision in expensive black silk. Her grief was as perfectly tailored as her dress. She was holding a crystal glass of wine, and her expression was a carefully constructed mask of sorrowful condescension. Well, Sophie began, her voice dripping with a familiar, saccharine venom. "Look what the tide washed in. I wasn't sure you'd even bother to show your face." Sophie had always been her father's perfect child. She had embraced the life Morgan rejected, marrying a man named Marcus whom their father had practically handpicked, a smarmy investment banker with a predatory smile and a lineage that mattered. Sophie's life was a performance of affluent perfection, and her resentment for Morgan's escape had only deepened over the years, curdling into a bitter jealousy she disguised as pity. "It's my father's funeral, Sophie," Morgan replied calmly, refusing to take the bait. "It was appropriate for me to be here." Sophie let out a short, unamused laugh. "Appropriate? You wouldn't know the meaning of the word. You haven't been appropriate a day in your life. Dad is dead, and you waltz in here after 20 years of silence as if you have some right to stand here." Her husband, Marcus, materialized at her side, placing a proprietary hand on her arm. He nodded curtly at Morgan, his eyes sweeping over her with a dismissive air, assessing her simple attire and finding it lacking. "Sophie, darling, let's not cause a scene," he murmured, though his eyes gleamed with the prospect of one. "Your sister has had a long journey." The words were placating, but the subtext was clear. You are an outsider here, a curiosity, a disruption to our grieving process. Alina hovered nervously in the background, wringing her hands. "Girls, please," she pleaded softly. "Not now. Your father," she trailed off, unable to finish the sentence, as if the very mention of his name might still invoke his thunderous disapproval. Morgan looked from her sister's hostile face to her mother's weak one and felt a profound sense of dislocation. She was a stranger here, a foreigner in the land of her birth. The sterile order of her military life suddenly seemed like a sanctuary, a logical, understandable world compared to this swamp of unspoken history and festering resentments. She had come for closure, but it was already clear that this house offered none. It only offered ghosts. The day of the funeral was a masterclass in performative grief. The sky over the small coastal town was a uniform sheet of gray, a fittingly somber backdrop for the procession of dark suits and funereal dresses filing into the historic stone church. Morgan sat alone in a pew near the back, a silent observer of a ceremony that felt both intimately familiar and completely alien. She watched her sister, Sophie, weeping gracefully into a lace-trimmed handkerchief, her husband Marcus standing beside her, a pillar of feigned, solemn support. She watched her mother, Eleanor, looking small and lost, a ship without its anchor, adrift in a sea of condolences from people who barely knew her. The eulogy was delivered by a business associate of her father's, a man who spoke in grand, sweeping terms about David Morgan's unwavering integrity, his commitment to community, and his deep love for his family. Morgan listened to the litany of sanitized virtues and felt nothing but a hollow echo. The man being described was a stranger to her. The father she knew was a man of rigid control, of conditional love, whose integrity was a tool for manipulation, and whose commitment to his family was contingent on their absolute obedience to his will. After the service, during the reception at the family home, a suffocating affair catered with the best food and wine money could buy, Morgan found herself cornered by distant relatives and old family friends. They offered her awkward sympathies, their eyes filled with a morbid curiosity. They saw her as a prodigal daughter, a cautionary tale. "It's been so long, Morgan," one aunt chirped, her gaze lingering on the severe cut of Morgan's dress. "We hardly recognized you. Your father, he would have been so." "Well, he would have been glad you came." The lie hung in the air between them, thick and cloying. Morgan simply nodded, her composure an impenetrable fortress. It was during one of these excruciating exchanges that a man she vaguely recognized approached her. He was older, with a kind, weathered face and eyes that held a spark of genuine warmth. He introduced himself as Arthur, a retired army colonel and a friend of her late grandfather. "I knew your grandfather, Elias, very well," he said, his voice a low, pleasant rumble that cut through the chatter of the room. "He spoke of you often, with immense pride." Morgan was taken aback. Her grandfather was the one member of the family who had understood her. A veteran of a bygone war, he had seen the same fire in her that her father had tried so desperately to extinguish. He had passed away when she was in her first year of officer training, and her father had forbidden her from attending his funeral, calling it an unnecessary distraction. "My grandfather," she asked, a flicker of genuine emotion breaking through her reserve. He never mentioned me to the rest of the family." Arthur smiled, a knowing, slightly sad expression on his face. "Elias was a wise man. He knew which battles to fight and which to wage in secret. He saw your strength, young lady. He used to say, 'That girl is forged from a different metal than the rest of them. She won't bend, she won't break.'" He was right. Arthur lowered his voice conspiratorially. "Your father, David, he was a good man in many ways, but he was blinded by his own vision of the world. He couldn't see the value in anything he didn't build or control himself. Elias, on the other hand, he understood that true legacy isn't about control. It's about letting something strong and true grow on its own." He patted her arm gently. "I just wanted you to know that your grandfather saw you. He was exceptionally proud." With that, he nodded and moved away, leaving Morgan standing amidst the crowd, feeling as though a small, crucial piece of her own history had just been handed back to her. The brief conversation was a sliver of light in the oppressive gloom of the day. It was a reminder that she hadn't been entirely alone in her rebellion. Someone important, had been in her corner all along. This knowledge settled deep within her, a ballast against the storm of family dysfunction raging around her. It didn't erase the pain of her father's rejection, but it reframed it. Her path had not been an act of defiance against her entire lineage, but rather a continuation of a legacy her grandfather had understood and cherished. She looked across the crowded room at Sophie, who was now holding court, regaling a captive audience with a tearful anecdote about her father. Morgan realized with sudden clarity that they were both living out legacies, just of a very different kind. Sophie was the heir to their father's kingdom of appearances and control. But Morgan, she now suspected, was the heir to something far more valuable, her grandfather's spirit of independence and strength. The weekend between the funeral and the will reading was an exercise in psychological endurance. The house, no longer filled with the hushed reverence of mourners, became a pressure cooker of simmering tension and unspoken resentments. Morgan retreated to her old bedroom, a space that had been preserved like a time capsule from her teenage years. Her books were still on the shelves, her academic awards still in a box in the closet, but it no longer felt like hers. It was a room belonging to a girl she barely remembered, a girl full of dreams her family had tried to crush. She spent her time in disciplined silence, reading, or going for long, solitary runs along the rugged coastline, the wind and spray of the ocean, a welcome antidote to the suffocating atmosphere of the house. Meanwhile, Sophie and Marcus took over the main living areas, their voices a constant, grating hum of entitlement. They were already redecorating in their minds, discussing which of their father's assets would be liquidated first. They moved through the house not as mourners, but as conquerors surveying their new territory. Their conversations were a brazen performance of their expectations, held just loud enough for Morgan to overhear. "The market is perfect for selling the beach condo," Marcus said one evening, swirling a glass of her father's expensive brandy. "We could use the capital to expand my portfolio." Sophie, reclining on the sofa, gestured vaguely at the antique furniture around them. "And this place needs a complete overhaul. It's so dated. Mother can move into the guest wing. It will be more manageable for her." They spoke of Alina as if she were another piece of furniture to be moved and managed, a relic of a past regime. And they spoke of Morgan not at all. In their narrative of the future, she simply didn't exist. It was a deliberate, cruel erasure, a continuation of their father's final decree. Morgan chose not to engage. Arguing would be pointless. It would be like reasoning with a hurricane. Her presence was a silent, unmovable object, a fact they could not ignore, no matter how hard they tried. The inevitable confrontation came on Sunday afternoon. Morgan was in the kitchen, making a simple cup of tea, when Sophie swept in, her face a mask of theatrical indignation. "I cannot believe your audacity," she began, dispensing with any preamble. "Just sitting here, skulking around the house like some kind of ghost. You have no right to be here." Morgan calmly placed her teacup on the counter. "I was invited, Sophie, by the lawyer, for the reading of the will." Sophie let out a bitter laugh. "The will? Oh, this is rich. Do you honestly think Dad would leave you anything? A single penny? After the humiliation you put him through? After you abandoned this family?" The word abandoned was a weapon Sophie had wielded for years. To her, Morgan's choice to build her own life was a personal betrayal. "I didn't abandon anyone," Morgan said, her voice dangerously quiet. "I chose a different path, a path Dad refused to accept." "A path," Sophie sneered, her voice rising. "You call running off to play soldier a path? Dad built a legacy for us, for this family. He gave us everything, and you spat in his face. You broke his heart, and you broke Mother's heart too." On cue, Alina appeared in the doorway, drawn by the raised voices. She looked from one daughter to the other, her expression one of weary panic. "Please, Sophie," she whispered. "Don't." But Sophie was relentless. "No, Mother, it's time she heard the truth. She comes back here after 2 decades, acting all high and mighty in her severe little outfits, looking down on all of us, judging us. But what has she ever done for this family? Nothing. She wasn't here for Dad's birthdays, his anniversaries, his illness. She was off playing war games while we were the ones who cared for him." Morgan's control finally frayed, not with anger, but with a deep, aching sadness. "You think I didn't want to be here, Sophie? He made his choice. He told me not to come back. He cut me off, you know he did. He gave you a choice," Sophie shrieked. "And you chose yourself, you always choose yourself. You're selfish, Morgan, and tomorrow you'll finally see what that selfishness has cost you. You'll see what it means to be truly cut off." Sophie's words were meant to wound, to inflict a final, decisive blow before the lawyer made it official. But they had the opposite effect. In that moment, Morgan felt a profound sense of pity for her sister. Sophie's entire identity was built on her father's approval, her inheritance high. Final gold star. She couldn't conceive of a world where a person's worth wasn't measured by what they were given. Morgan had spent 22 years building a life where her worth was measured by what she had earned. They were speaking different languages, from different universes. As Sophie stormed out of the room, leaving a trembling Alina in her wake, Morgan picked up her teacup. Her hand was perfectly steady. The battle tomorrow wasn't about money or property. It was about the validation of a life lived. And for the first time, Morgan realized she didn't need a single word from her father's will to grant her that. The offices of Alastair, Finch, and Beaumont were located in a historic brick building downtown, a bastion of old money and discreet legal maneuvering. The air inside was heavy with the scent of aged paper, leather, and polish. It was a place where family fortunes were divided and dynasties were codified into legal scripture. Mr. Alastair, a man who seemed as ancient and permanent as the oak paneling on his office walls, greeted them with a somber, professional courtesy. He had been her father's lawyer for 40 years, and before that, his father had been her grandfather's lawyer. His face was a roadmap of inscrutable neutrality, but as Morgan met his gaze, she thought she saw a flicker of something else in his pale blue eyes, a hint of curiosity, perhaps even respect. The family arranged themselves in the plush leather chairs facing his imposing desk. Alina sat huddled in her seat, looking small and overwhelmed. Sophie and Marcus sat together, a united front of confident expectation. Sophie was practically vibrating with anticipation, her grief from the funeral having miraculously transformed into a kind of grim excitement. She was on the verge of her coronation. Marcus, ever the silent partner, had a predatory stillness about him, the look of a shark that smells blood in the water. Morgan chose a chair slightly apart from the others, creating a physical distance that mirrored the emotional chasm between them. She sat with the perfect posture that had been drilled into her for decades, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She felt strangely serene, a detached observer at the final act of a play she had never wanted a part in. Her family saw this as the day of her ultimate humiliation, the public confirmation of her disinheritance. For her, it was merely a formality, the final signature on a document of estrangement that had been written in pen long ago. Mr. Alastair cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the hushed room. He adjusted his spectacles and picked up a thick document bound in a dark blue cover. "We are gathered here today," he began, his voice a dry, formal drone, "for the reading of the last will and testament of Mr. David Elias Morgan. I will now read the document in its entirety, as per his instructions." He began to read, his words weaving the final narrative her father had constructed for himself. It was a document filled with self-aggrandizing prose about hard work, family values, and the importance of legacy. He made provisions for his beloved wife, Alina, leaving her the house and a living stipend, granting her the right to reside there for the remainder of her life. It sounded generous, but Morgan recognized the subtext. It was another form of control, ensuring her mother would remain a permanent fixture in the monument he had built to himself. Then came the bequests for Sophie. Her father had been generous. He left her his entire portfolio of stocks and bonds, a considerable sum that would guarantee her and Marcus a life of exceptional comfort. He bequeathed to her the family's vacation properties, the art collection, and various other assets. As Mr. Alastair detailed the extent of her inheritance, a smug, triumphant smile began to play on Sophie's lips. She shot a quick, venomous glance at Morgan, a look that said, "See. This is what loyalty gets you. This is what you threw away." Marcus's mask of composure slipped for a moment and a greedy light danced in his eyes. He squeezed his wife's hand, a gesture of shared victory. Finally, Mr. Alastair paused, taking a slow, deliberate sip of water. He turned to a new page and the mood in the room shifted. This was it. The moment of the final, posthumous condemnation. "Regarding my eldest daughter," Mr. Alastair read, his voice unwavering, "Morgan." He used only her first name, a final, petty act of depersonalization. "Who chose to abandon her family and disregard the values I hold dear, I leave her nothing. It is my express wish that she receive no part of my estate, my assets, or my legacy. This decision is not made in haste or anger, but as a final consequence of the path she has chosen for herself. She has been formally and irrevocably disinherited." A profound silence descended upon the room. It was done. The final nail had been hammered into the coffin of their relationship. Sophie's smile widened to a triumphant smirk. She didn't even try to hide her satisfaction. Marcus sat back in his chair, the picture of contentment. Alina predictably began to weep silently, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, her tears a mixture of shame and relief that the confrontation was finally over. All eyes turned to Morgan, expecting a reaction. A cry of outrage, a plea for justice, a display of wounded pride. They wanted to see her break. They wanted to witness the consequence of her rebellion. But Morgan did not give them the satisfaction. She met their expectant gazes with an expression of absolute calm. Her face was a mask of placid neutrality. Inside, she felt a strange sense of lightness. The word disinherited was not a wound, it was a release. It was the sound of the last chain breaking. She was finally completely free. Her father's final act was not to hurt her, but to confirm what she already knew. His love had always been transactional, and she had refused to pay the price. The silence stretched, becoming awkward. Sophie's smirk began to falter, her victory soured by Morgan's lack of a reaction. It was then that Mr. Alastair cleared his throat again, a small, deliberate sound that drew all attention back to him. He placed her father's will pointedly to one side of his desk. "This," he announced to the confused room, "concludes the reading of the last will and testament of David Morgan." Sophie and Marcus began to stir, ready to leave, their business concluded. But Mr. Alastair held up a hand, stopping them. "However," he said, his voice taking on a new tone, one of quiet authority and perhaps a hint of theatricality, "there is another matter to address, a separate legal instrument that I am bound by duty to execute at this time." He reached into a drawer in his large mahogany desk and retrieved a different envelope. It was old, made of thick, creamy parchment, and sealed with a dark red wax seal bearing a distinctive family crest, the crest of her grandfather, Elias Morgan. The air in the room crackled with a new, uncertain energy. Sophie and Marcus froze, their expressions shifting from triumph to confusion. Alina looked up from her weeping, her brow furrowed. "What is that?" Sophie demanded, her voice sharp. "I don't understand." Mr. Alastair looked over the rim of his glasses, first at Sophie, then at the others, before letting his gaze settle firmly, and for the first time with undisguised respect, on Morgan. "This," he explained, holding up the envelope, "is a testamentary trust established 50 years ago by your grandfather, Elias Morgan. The terms of the trust were explicit and ironclad. It was to remain sealed and unexecuted until the day of his son David's death. David himself was aware of its existence, though not its contents. He was legally forbidden from ever altering or accessing it." A knot of dread began to form in Sophie's stomach. Marcus leaned forward, his eyes narrowed, the gears of his financial mind turning rapidly. "A trust? For whom?" he asked, his voice tight. Mr. Alastair did not answer him directly. Instead, he carefully broke the wax seal with a small, silver letter opener. He unfolded the document within, which was covered in his grandfather's strong, decisive handwriting. He scanned the first few lines, and a small, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. He then looked directly at Morgan, ignoring the other 3 people in the room as if they had suddenly become invisible. The entire dynamic of the room had tilted on its axis, and the power was shifting, flowing away from Sophie and towards the silent, still figure of her older sister. Mr. Alastair cleared his throat, not out of necessity this time, but for dramatic effect. He was, Morgan realized, enjoying this moment immensely. He had been a silent witness to her family's dynamics for decades, and this was his moment to deliver the final, unexpected verdict. He began to read from the document, his voice ringing with a clarity and force that had been absent before. "This document is for my granddaughter," he read, the words of Elias Morgan echoing across the years. Then, Mr. Alastair lowered the page and addressed her formally, his voice imbued with a profound deference that stunned the room into absolute silence. He used a title she had never once mentioned to her family, a rank she had earned through 2 decades of relentless effort, sacrifice, and dedication, a world away from this petty, gilded cage. "Lieutenant General Morgan," he declared, his voice resonating with the weight of the title. "This is for you." The silence that followed was not merely an absence of sound. It was a physical presence, a thick, suffocating blanket that pressed down on the room. The title, Lieutenant General, hung in the air, an incomprehensible, explosive piece of data that their minds struggled to process. Sophie's face, which had been a mask of smug satisfaction just moments before, seemed to crumble in slow motion. Her jawie. NT slack, the triumphant smirk collapsing into a gaping maw of disbelief. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, darted from the lawyer to Morgan, searching for some sign that this was a cruel, elaborate joke. Marcus, the cool, calculating banker, was visibly stunned. His face lost all its color, leaving behind a pasty, shocked pallor. He stared at Morgan as if seeing her for the first time, not as his wife's outcast sister, but as something else entirely, something powerful and unknown. Elinor let out a small, sharp gasp, her hand flying to her chest. She looked at her eldest daughter, the one she had pitied and quietly mourned, and saw a complete stranger. "Lieutenant General," Sophie finally stammered, the words catching in her throat. "What are you talking about? That's impossible. She's just a soldier." Mr. Alastair arched a single, eloquent eyebrow. "On the contrary," he said coolly, "Lieutenant General Morgan is one of the highest-ranking officers in the armed forces. A position, I might add, she achieved through exceptional merit." He turned his attention back to the document in his hands, leaving Sophie to flounder in her own ignorance. The revelation of Morgan's rank was a strategic strike, a perfectly executed maneuver that had shattered their entire perception of her. They had painted her as a failure, a misguided child playing at a pointless career. The reality of her success was so far beyond their limited imagination that it had short-circuited their brains. They had been judging a game of checkers, while she had been mastering three-dimensional chess. Mr. Alastair continued reading from the grandfather's trust, his voice calm and steady, each word another blow to Sophie and Marcus's crumbling world. "I, Elias Morgan," he read, "being of sound mind and body, foresaw the possibility that my son David, in his rigidity, might fail to appreciate the unique strengths of his eldest daughter. He sees value only in what he can control, in assets he can measure on a balance sheet. But true wealth, true legacy, is forged in character, in resilience, in the courage to choose one's own path, however difficult." The lawyer paused, looking pointedly at the document before continuing. "Therefore, I have set aside the entirety of my own personal fortune, a portfolio I have managed and grown independently of the family business, into this secure trust. This trust is to be the sole inheritance of my granddaughter, Morgan. It is to be given to her only upon David's passing, as a testament to her independence, and as a reward for having the fortitude to build a life on her own terms, free from her father's narrow expectations." He then arrived at the final, devastating paragraph. He looked up from the page, directly into Marcus's greed-filled eyes, and delivered the coup de grace. "The current valuation of the trust's assets, which includes a diversified portfolio of international stocks, real estate holdings, and private equity, is estimated at," he named a figure. It was a number so astronomically large, so utterly staggering, that it sucked all the remaining oxygen from the room. It wasn't just more than David Morgan's estate, it was an order of magnitude greater. It was generational wealth, a fortune that dwarfed the comfortable, provincial riches her father had spent his life accumulating, and that Sophie had just inherited. Sophie made a strangled noise, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage and despair. "No," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "No, that's a lie, it's a forgery. Father would never have allowed it. She manipulated him. She manipulated all of you." She lunged to her feet, pointing a trembling finger at Morgan. "She has done nothing to deserve this. I was the one who was here. I was the dutiful daughter, me." Marcus, recovering from his initial shock, grabbed his wife's arm, his own face a dark thundercloud of fury. "This is outrageous," he snarled at the lawyer. "We will contest this. This is a clear case of undue influence." Mr. Alastair remained unflappable. He had anticipated this reaction. He calmly removed his spectacles and began to polish them with a silk handkerchief. "I assure you, Mr. and Mrs. Sterling," he said, using their married name with deliberate, cold formality, "this document is legally unassailable. It was established by my father, reviewed by our firm's top estate planners, and its provisions are ironclad. Your grandfather was a very shrewd and very careful man. He ensured there were no loopholes. Your father had no legal power to touch it, and neither do you. The trust belongs, in its entirety, to Lieutenant General Morgan." He said her title again, letting it land like a physical weight. The power in the room had not just shifted, it had undergone a cataclysmic reversal. Morgan, the disinherited outcast, was now the wealthiest and most powerful person in the room by an unimaginable margin. Sophie and Marcus, the triumphant heirs, had been reduced to petty provincial land owners, their prized inheritance suddenly looking like table scraps. Sophie finally collapsed back into her chair, her face buried in her hands, her body shaking with furious, impotent sobs. The perfect, curated grief she had worn all week had been stripped away, revealing the raw, ugly greed beneath. Marcus stared at his weeping wife, but his expression was no longer one of sympathy. It was cold, calculating, and filled with a new, terrifying contempt. He was looking at a woman who had just cost him a fortune. The foundation of their perfect, transactional marriage had just cracked wide open. Amidst the wreckage, Morgan remained silent. She watched the complete and utter demolition of her family's carefully constructed world, not with triumph, but with a quiet, profound sense of sorrowful vindication. Her grandfather had not just left her his money, he had left her justice. Morgan walked out of the lawyer's office, leaving the cacophony of Sophie's hysterics and Marcus's impotent threats behind her. The cool air of the street felt like a balm after the suffocating atmosphere of the room. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The image was seared into her memory, her sister's face, contorted with a rage born of pure envy, her brother-in-law's mask of civility slipping to reveal the avarice beneath, and her mother, a silent, weeping witness to the implosion of the world she had so carefully and so passively inhabited. Morgan didn't return to the family home. There was nothing for her there now but ghosts and scorched earth. Instead, she drove, with no particular destination in mind, heading south along the winding coastal highway. She found a small, secluded beach she remembered from her childhood, a place her grandfather used to take her to skip stones across the water. She walked out onto the damp sand, the gray ocean churning before her, its rhythmic roar a soothing counterpoint to the storm that had just broken in her life. She stood there for a long time, the wind whipping strands of her hair across her face, as she processed the monumental shift that had just occurred. The feeling was not one of elation or giddy triumph, as Sophie would have surely felt in her position. It was something far more complex, a heavy, weighty sense of vindication mingled with a profound and aching sadness. The money, the staggering sum that had shattered her family, was almost an abstraction. It was a tool, a resource, a responsibility she now had to bear. The true inheritance, the thing that brought tears to her eyes for the first time in years, was the validation from her grandfather. He had seen her. In a family that had demanded conformity, he had celebrated her spirit. In a world that had tried to make her small, he had trusted in her ability to become great. His trust, his secret faith in her, was a gift more precious than any portfolio. It was the armor she hadn't known she was wearing all these years. Her father had used his will as a final, cruel weapon to wound her, but her grandfather had used his to hand her a shield and a sword. The justice was bittersweet. To gain this final, undeniable affirmation of her worth, she had to witness the complete moral disintegration of her family. Sophie's raw, unveiled greed had been ugly, a testament to a life spent valuing only what could be bought. Her mother's passive complicity, her inability to stand up for her own child against her husband's tyranny, was a tragedy of its own. Morgan felt a pang of guilt, not for her success, but for the irrevocable damage the revelation had caused. A family, however dysfunctional, had been broken beyond any hope of repair. She pulled out her phone and saw a string of missed calls and frantic, venomous text messages from Sophie, accusing her of being a thief, a snake, a monster. There was one call from her mother. She hesitated, then listened to the voicemail. Eleanor's voice was thin and shaky, a pale whisper of a woman. "Morgan, darling. I didn't know. I never knew. Please, can we just talk?" The plea was 22 years too late. The time for talking, for a mother to defend her daughter, had long since passed. Morgan knew that any conversation they had now would be tainted by the new reality of her wealth. Her mother wasn't reaching out to the daughter she had allowed to be exiled. She was reaching out to the lieutenant general, the heiress. With a heavy heart, Morgan deleted the voicemail and blocked both their numbers. It was not an act of cruelty, but one of self-preservation. Some wounds could not be healed. They could only be cordoned off to prevent further infection. She was closing the door, not out of anger, but for the sake of her own hard-won peace. As the sun began to set, casting a pale, watery light over the ocean, she finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of her journey. She had left this town a determined girl, and she had returned a victorious woman. But victory, she was learning, came at a cost. The cost was the family she once had, the illusion of a home she could never truly return to. And as she stood on that lonely beach, she grieved not for the father who had rejected her, but for the family that could have been, and for the girl who had had to walk away from it all to save herself. 6 months later, the sterile, orderly world of Morgan's military base felt more like home than ever. The echoes from the will reading had faded, replaced by the familiar rhythms of command and responsibility. News from her former life trickled in through the old family lawyer, Mr. Alastair, who had become a reluctant but steadfast correspondent. He reported, in his dry, factual prose, that Sophie and Marcus's marriage was imploding. The revelation of Morgan's fortune had exposed the transactional nature of their union. Marcus, enraged at the lost inheritance, had grown cold and contemptuous. Sophie, in turn, had become bitter and resentful, her life of affluent ease suddenly feeling like a second-rate consolation prize. They were fighting, constantly and viciously, over the assets they did have, their shared greed now a corrosive acid eating away at their partnership. Her mother, Eleanor, remained in the large, empty house, a ghost rattling around in a mausoleum. Mr. Alastair mentioned she had tried to contact Morgan through his office several times, but had been politely rebuffed per Morgan's instructions. She was, he wrote, a lonely woman, trapped in the gilded cage her husband had built, and which she had never had the courage to leave. Morgan read these updates not with satisfaction, but with a detached sense of pity. Their downfall was not her victory. It was the inevitable outcome of lives built on flawed foundations of greed, control, and fear. Her focus was now on the future, on the immense responsibility her grandfather had bestowed upon her. She had no interest in a life of idle luxury. Her 2 decades of service had instilled in her a profound sense of purpose that money could not buy, but could now amplify. With the help of a discreet team of financial advisors recommended by Mr. Alastair, she began the process of channeling her new resources. She established the Elias Morgan Foundation, a charitable organization dedicated to 2 causes close to her heart and his. The first was providing scholarships and grants for young women entering traditionally male-dominated fields, STEM, law enforcement, and, of course, the military. It was a tribute to the grandfather who had believed in her ambition when no one else had. The second branch of the foundation was dedicated to supporting veterans and their families, providing resources for mental health, career transition, and housing. It was a way of giving back to the community that had saved her, the institution that had taken a broken, defiant girl and forged her into a leader. One crisp autumn afternoon, she was attending the inaugural awards ceremony for her foundation's first scholarship recipients. She stood at the back of the auditorium, watching as a dozen bright, fiercely intelligent young women accepted their awards, their faces shining with hope and determination. In each of them, she saw a flicker of the girl she had been, a girl fighting to carve out a place for herself in a world that often told her she didn't belong. A young woman, an aspiring aerospace engineer, concluded her acceptance speech by saying, "This scholarship is more than just financial support. It's a message. It's a message that someone believes in us. Someone we've never even met has invested in our future. And that belief is the most powerful fuel there is." The words resonated deep within Morgan's soul. This was her new legacy. It was not a legacy of property or bloodlines, but one of purpose and empowerment. Her father had wanted to erase her from his story, but her grandfather had given her the power to write her own and to help others write theirs. She was no longer just a soldier. She was a benefactor, a mentor, a force for change. Her family had tried to cut her out, to render her invisible. But now, her influence, funded by the past and aimed at the future, would be felt for generations to come. The justice she had received in that stuffy lawyer's office was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a new one, a better one. And now, a final message for our viewers. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. If stories of resilience and earned justice resonate with you, please consider liking this video and sharing it with others. Comment below with your thoughts on Morgan's story. Your engagement helps our community grow, and we look forward to bringing you another powerful story very soon.